Hello, my name's Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, Annie and I started Garden Masterclass 6 years ago to put on live educational events in the British Isles. But with COVID, the lockdown, in April 2020, we started doing a public service broadcast. And then we've settled down to running both live events, but also with a big online content. So we do this Thursday Garden Chat once a week on a Thursday evening, 6 o'clock Western European time. And those recordings then go up on to YouTube. Now, we also do webinars. We have a webinar season that runs through from September to May. We get leading experts globally from the garden and landscape world to talk about their specialism. And of course, that's an opportunity to ask them questions. Most of those webinars are recorded and are then available through Vimeo from our website. We also put on courses. There's a course on naturalistic planting design, for example, which I do with Professor Nigel Dunnett of the University of Sheffield in Northern England. And we sometimes get involved in organising conferences. We do all sorts of things that are aimed at encouraging quality planting, quality gardening, knowledge about plants and botany, plant science, and we hope you'll join us. We have a membership scheme which gives you discounts on our webinars and live events and various other goodies, but also you can just sign up for our monthly email newsletter to keep in touch with what we're doing. We believe, and we've been told by many people, that what we do is unique. It's unique in the range and quality of people we talk to and our global reach and our diversity. So hope you enjoy this particular episode and do come back for more. Great. Thank you, Annie. Thank you. Well, this evening we're going over to the United States, or as we Brits like to say, our rebel colonies. I'm really pleased to have got Rebecca McMackin, who is somebody I've been following for some time. She has a great reputation for her work at Brooklyn Bridge Park and for a blog which is really one of the most kind of informative ones around for those interested in ecological planting and the relationship between biodiversity and what we do in our gardens. She's a one of those people who's full of ideas and insights, and we're very pleased to have her. So, Rebecca, first of all, we always like to ask people, what got you into plants and gardens and wildlife and nature?
Oh, such a deep question. You know, I grew up on a small farm in Connecticut. And it was something I gardened. My first garden was when I was 6 years old, and I grew carrots. And but I never considered it a career. It wasn't something that was, you know, something I thought I could do as an adult. So I did a bunch of things. I had a pretty wild and rambunctious youth, and I somehow ended up doing a graduate degree in ecology in British Columbia, and I was focused on freshwater ecology. It wasn't plants at all, but I was with one of my friends and we were outside the lab and we walked up to a southern magnolia tree that had been planted there. And there was one of the flowers that was, you know, the size of a dinner plate. And my friend Allie just said, I was talking about how gorgeous it was. And she said, Magnolia grandiflora, they're from your region. And it was like I was thunderstruck. I felt like she was reciting an incantation, and I just wanted more of that. The fact that I didn't know that plants had names like that were gorgeous, and it seemed like this like magical knowledge kind of, and I just started going after it, and I never stopped. And then once I finished that degree, I moved back to Connecticut, and I started gardening. And I, you know, in the same way you would like do yoga, like just sort of like taking care of yourself, doing some gardening. And I realized that it was the sort of science that I was actually interested in. That academia and statistics and publishing and sitting in front of a computer was not actually the sort of science that I really responded to. That within gardening, within ecological gardening specifically, it was a continuous process of research and experimentation. And but then none of the other unfortunate hierarchies and requirements of academia. And so I just took to it. I was absolutely enthralled from the get-go, and I turned it into a profession, and I moved to New York City to garden for the Parks Department.
Right. So kind of round about when was this that you moved to New York?
I had just turned 30, and my dad kicked me out of the house. He was like, go find a husband. And I was like, okay. And I did. I was like, it worked. He's great. But yeah, I was 30. So that was 16 years ago now. And, you know, I had a lot of background already. I'd been gardening my whole life and ecology and whatnot. And I worked for the Parks Department. It was an amazing place to work, just fascinating, difficult, incredibly difficult. But I was the head gardener for Washington Square Park, which is this incredibly historic, incredibly busy park in the middle of Manhattan. And I saw it through renovations, and it was just, you know, there's celebrities and chess players and buskers and people literally standing on soapboxes or like milk crates trying to like just yell to the world. It was a very political park. Like every protest in the city would end at Washington Square Park. And I realized there how important these spaces are to democracy, and that there are people who hold those spaces and take care of those spaces. And then that was me. And I was hooked. I was like, this is so important. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And so that's where I really, you know, I was already into horticulture, already into ecological horticulture. That's where I was public horticulture is what I really want to do. And I consider myself a public servant as a result of that.
So when you joined the New York City Parks Department, what was their ethos like? I mean, were they getting into natives, or were they still quite sort of stuck on all the traditionals?
Stuck on all the traditionals. But there was a movement led by entomologists and the Xerces Society, which is a society in the US that promotes pollinators, but really, you know, invertebrates of all types, and gardening on farms, on public lands, all over the place, research, etc. They started reaching out to gardeners specifically, and they held these classes where you could just learn about bees. And I went, and again, it was just like a world opening up, right? It's like the sort of things that we all experience every day in horticulture, that there's just a never-ending series of wonders. And this was one of them. And then, you know, I had this new knowledge of bees and flowers, and then I went back again from a academic sort of research perspective. It was like my whole life was field work. Like I just got to sit in a garden and like watch bees and butterflies interact with flowers.
Yes.
I think not only was it the most gorgeous thing I had ever seen, but it was this thrill of the undiscovered, you know, this thrill of seeing something for the first time that people had forgotten about or hadn't known. And so again, just like I just followed that.
Yeah. Great. And then you went on to was it Brooklyn Bridge?
Yes, yeah. From there,
tell us, because that's been your big project, hasn't it? So
yes. I was at Brooklyn Bridge Park for just over a decade. They brought me on to manage horticulture right after the first sections of the park opened. The park, for anyone who's not aware, is a brand new 85-acre post-industrial park in Brooklyn. It's built on reclaimed shipping piers. And so it's entirely constructed, and I'll talk about it in my garden masterclass. But it, oh great, here's some photos. This is a different garden that I could talk about later. But at Brooklyn Bridge Park, it was just this incredible opportunity. You know, it was a real honor to work there. It was designed by Michael von Valkenburg and Associates, and during the design, there was a lot of community input. And I later became friends with the ecologists who had spent years advocating for the park to be incredible for people, but also provide habitat for New York City wildlife. And MVVA was super into it. They had done similar projects and they consulted with a bunch of ecologists and they created a park with ecology in mind. And, I had just come off of a master's in biology, and I was just getting acquainted with urban ecology, and it was this perfect storm of fascinating, rewarding, incredibly difficult work that I did, for most of my adult life. And I was essentially tasked with manifesting the design of MVVA while kickstarting all of these ecosystems and gardens. And of course, building out a staff and an entire operation to do so, initially from our trailer that we all worked like 70 hours a week from. And it was, absolutely wild and wonderful.
Right. So, could you tell us about about some of the planting you were able to install and maintain?
Yeah, at Brooklyn Bridge Park. So
Yeah.
the perspective on planting at Brooklyn Bridge Park was a great deviation from the history of formal horticulture. I think, normally in horticulture, their gardens are static, there's not a lot of movement. And MVVA came up with this idea of managed succession, which is how they designed the park, where there were big sections where they planted tiny little trees. And the idea was that as those trees grew, the gardening staff was going to edit them and prune them, and then eventually the mature canopy would win out. That turned out to be, here's a great photo. This is Brooklyn Bridge Park here. That was a difficult operation to carry out, and it didn't work quite as easily as planned. But what happened was that as those trees grew, the understory of huge percentages of the park got shaded out, and we ended up going in and replanting big sections of the park. And that gave us an opportunity to experiment with different plants, to work with ecologists, work with entomologists. We would, be able to say, okay, there's this blueberry bee. There's this wonderful little bee that is very rare in New York City and feeds its babies exclusively blueberry pollen. What if we plant 75 of them and really just try to support this species in New York City? Same thing with, there's a little cellophane bee. Oh, there's the blueberry bee right on cue. There's a little cellophane bee that specializes on tiarella, the foam flower, which is one of our most beautiful and helpful native plants. And so what we were able to do there is say, okay, we want to try and attract this bee, which we haven't yet, hasn't shown up in the park, but we wanted to try and support it. So we would just buy flat after flat of tiarella and just really spread it all over the park. I actually made the gardeners angry one year because I ordered like 10 flats of tiarella and was like, fit it in. We're just gonna put it in the park. And so it was always this balancing act where we were making this gorgeous park for people, right? It could only be read as cared for and beautiful. We would never allow it to be read as wild and neglected. We were always walking that line. But at the same time, recognizing the fact that in a city, the real value of having access to that much land in New York City, you can make some real dents in trying to bring back specific populations of both plants and animals. And we took that responsibility very seriously. We brought in endangered plants, we brought in threatened plants, and tried to get them established in the park. Oh, I think you're muted, Noel.
You refer to working with entomologists. Was this them acting as consultants, or have you also been part of any kind of research project? Because it would be wonderful to know about kind of outcomes, which are so important in terms of driving forward how we promote biodiversity in cities.
Absolutely critical. So we worked with a lot of consultants. And we tried very hard to convince researchers to come to the park and do work in the park, and we sadly failed. And that effort is still ongoing. And it breaks my heart because I think that as much as there's still a ton of research that could be done there that could be really, really valuable, there was this incredible window and we tried to track it. There's like a lot of bad data. We collected like a ton of terrible, not publishable information. But the we would try to lure actual researchers into the park. And the thing that we missed out on, sorry, I lost my train of thought, is watching wildlife colonize a space that had been constructed for them, to go from essentially a vacuum to a space that had been designed for wildlife, and then to watch those waves of populations then come in. That was the main thing that I was hoping someone would take advantage of. And it was just a matter of funding. You know, people's agendas were full. They didn't have the capacity to do it. And we just unfortunately never made it happen. But I'm still hopeful that it will happen someday.
I mean, obviously the High Line and various other places in the city are working on, you know, similar things. But is there much coordination and meeting between you all, or is it completely informal?
No, we worked a lot together, and of course, different people all over the city would go from organization to organization, and that was intentional. We saw at Brooklyn Bridge Park, we were, aside from the High Line, probably the best funded park in the city. And we saw ourselves as being one of the only properly funded parks in the city. And we recognized that this was unusual and thought, okay, how can we take advantage of these resources and then spread our knowledge, spread this work farther into the city, into parks that might not have as much money, communities that aren't around us? How do we make this really a public service for people? One of the ways that we did that was by trying to train employees and send them out into the other parks. And that worked really well. There were a lot of folks who went into other institutions and started the very similar programs that we had going on at Brooklyn Bridge Park. All worked together, all talked together. We would have meetings. It was a very, very exciting time to be in horticulture in New York City. Like, there's great work happening there.
Yes. And then you obviously decided to move on. So how would you describe your work profile now?
That is a confusing, difficult question that I'm still working on. I left Brooklyn Bridge Park after it was done, after it had been completed. And I knew that the folks who, when I left, were more than capable of taking care of it. This is Rashid Paulson in that picture, and this is Evelyn Manlove, and they are a big part of the team who is now managing the park. Rashid's director of horticulture, Evelyn's horticulturalist, and they're fantastic. And there's other folks as well. I knew when I left that they were going to do, you know, not just carry on the work, but just do awesome new stuff. And so I felt really confident leaving, and they're still doing. And then I left because I got a fellowship at Harvard called the Loeb Fellowship. And so that was an exciting opportunity to switch gears, try something new, think about where I could be most useful to this movement that I care about. And, you know, I felt like I realized actually that I had been at Brooklyn Bridge Park for most of my life. And I was like, I've got to get out of here. I've got to go do something new. And so I left to go try something new.
So you're working now with a number of
projects. So right now, let's see, I just took a job. I'm the Arboretum curator for a historic cemetery in the Bronx. That is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, again, to focus on urban ecology. And there's just so much history there. It's a fun woodlawn cemetery, and it's marvelous because it's like the exact opposite of Brooklyn Bridge Park. I'm not building anything. I'm caring for this historic, venerated landscape, and then restoring these grave sites that were done by the greats of American landscape architects. There's Beatrix Farrand, there's the Olmsted brothers, who all designed, like in the 1920s, these incredible landscapes that need to be restored. And so it's a marvelous, marvelous position to be in. So I'm doing that. I'm also, of course, still lecturing, teaching, writing. I just did a TED Talk, which was crazy and ridiculous. And then I'm hoping still to do design work in the public realm. I did. You saw those photos in the beginning. I just did a garden for the Brooklyn Museum as well.
All right, great, yeah. Yes. So, I mean, what's the climate like in terms of funding and support at the moment?
for me personally.
Well, for creating these kind of spaces, because it always feels very
Oh,
sort of
so tough, right? I think,
yeah.
A lot of us are motivated by factors other than financial gain. And that's why this work
Yes, one
continues to
way
get
of putting
done.
it. Yes, yes.
So I think in private horticulture, there's a lot of money, obviously.
Yes, yes.
And in public horticulture, there's a good amount of money as well. Most of that goes to landscape architects, I think, as we all know. But in New York City, I think the Highline really showed developers really the power of a beautiful garden and a public park to make them billions of dollars. And so you see these really well-funded, beautifully manicured gardens starting to proliferate all around, which is great. That's great. I would love to see that move, outside of the development realm into Connecticut, for instance, which doesn't really have a sense of public horticulture in the way that New York City does, because cities are fundamentally different. But it's hard.
Now I was wondering when you started your blog, which is I would say it's a fantastic blog. It's very much a portal, because one of the really, really useful things you do is you reference research, you reference news stories, you reference information. And that makes it just an incredibly useful place to go to find out stuff. And that provides a great service, as well as your own doings and thoughts and opinions. But so when did you start the blog?
Oh gosh, I mean, I tried to get every organization that I was on the board of, I tried to get them to do the same thing for years. I was like, please start this service. People need this. This is a service that we need. And it never happened. So I just started it, gosh, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, at some point during COVID. And yeah, I like to call it a newsletter, which is just, it's like a blog. You kind of go to a blog, and a newsletter kind of comes to you and has events, and you sit down with it and can take it seriously. But I really care about the work of gardening, but I also really care about the movement around ecological horticulture and the people doing this work. And gardeners tend to have their heads down and their butts up, and they're like doing the work. And there's sometimes not that many of us kind of looking around and looking at the field and being like, how can we support them? How can we grow this movement? Although there are people who do that, like both of you. There's Jennifer Jewell, there's BIPOC Hort movement in the US, there's Margaret Roach. There's people who are cultivating the gardeners, right? Who are gardening the gardeners. And I just naturally like to do that. I like to organize people. And so I see all of my role is like facilitating that work, right? Facilitating the growth of this movement, as well as being kind of a gossip columnist. Like, I think that I want everyone to know who is working on cool projects, who is making a complete fool out of themselves, who is, discovering something cool that everybody should know. And I want to grow not just knowledge, but like the connection between people and each other's work, so that this can really be a community, as well as a movement. That's the goal of the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Good. And now there's various, I don't know, should I say, controversies you waded in on. I mean, one of them I think that I was particularly interested in, which you hear such contradictory things, is about the impact of honeybees, domestic bees, on wild bees. And I think one of the reasons for the confusion here is I think the situation is probably perhaps quite different from one country or region to another. But I mean, what do you think the latest evidence is for your part of the world?
And I think, there's research in North America that says that the drive to save the bees is so powerful that it crosses the political divide. That it doesn't matter what your political leanings are, you really want to save the bees. And so it's like hard to see that as a negative. Although I did also read recently that people asked kids if they could save either bees or elephants, which one they would save, and they said bees. And I was like, I don't know, that's like a little too too much emphasis on bees here. And I think that, you know, honeybees are magical, right? Honey is like this incredible, incredible thing. And it's a wonderful gateway. And obviously people have this like marvelous impulse to save the bees. I see that rather as being misguided, which a lot of entomologists, a lot of people in ecological horticulture see that as misguided, harmful, you know, people spreading misinformation, et cetera. I feel like rather than seeing it in that negative light, it's an opportunity to continue those conversations, to say, oh, honeybees are just one of our many bees. And did you know that they are actually agriculturally managed livestock as opposed to wild? And so, you know, I think it shows that people care, and it shows that people want to get involved, and it gives a fantastic opening. And I think a lot of people in this movement have responded really positively to further educate people. And the knowledge about native bees is also really proliferating. That you find people like in the grocery store. You know, I was talking to a lady at a tile store the other day talking about native bees. There's so many of just common folks now who understand this stuff. And I think that the colony collapse disorder really fostered that conversation, and we took advantage of it and shifted it.
Yeah. Yes.
How is the conversation in the UK? Are people like,
well, I think the kind of save the bee, it kind of almost got to a kind of hysteria at some point. I think a lot of that has calmed down, and I think a big part of the reason for that is that there's much more publicity now given to people like Jane Memoto pointing out that in fact it's wild bee populations in Britain that are really suffering, but also the more recent research evidence that wild bees, at least in Britain, play a much more important role in fertilizing agricultural crops such as fruit trees than was previously thought. So that they're actually doing. They're actually doing quite a bit of the agricultural heavy lifting, and so I think it has become a much more balanced conversation. But I mean, the trouble is, people do sort of blur. I mean, one of the first things when you meet Jane Memmott, who we had on last week, was she says, "I'm interested in wild bees. I'm not interested in honeybees," and she really needs to make that distinction. But I think we are getting a more balanced view. Now, one of the kind of really remarkable things, one of the sort of tides you have clearly risen, is that of the interest in native plants in the United States. I mean, I remember my first trip to the US was in 1992, and I'd had a commission to do a book for, it was actually going to be an RH, a book for a London publisher, but it was have to have this kind of RHS stamp of approval. And because we knew we would be dealing with a fairly a North American market as well, we thought, well, let's include. It was a book about growing wildflowers, and I thought, well, let's include North American stuff as well. And as I went on this bit of a kind of research road trip from Massachusetts down to North Carolina, and these were the days when the average front lawn in the US it was just kind of 2 millimeter high shaved grass, and perhaps there'd be a kind of square meter of phlox somewhere. And I went to various places like Garden in the Woods, Bowman's Hill Preserve, Chapel Hill Botanic Garden. These seemed like kind of isolated islands, and I would have found it very difficult at the time to believe just what incredible success this movement has had. And so, in a way, the sort of there is a sort of very different new paradigm. But I'm kind of tempted to be slightly naughty and ask you, I bet you grow some exotics. Which are the exotics, the non-native species you wouldn't want to be without?
I mean, I'm a human being. I am a slave to beauty. I have so much trouble with ranunculaceae. I just love it. Love delphinium, love anemones. But yeah, I am not a purist in the terms of I know that those folks exist. That is not me. I care a lot about ecological functionality. Is the term that and those relationships between plants and animals, and fostering those relationships between plants and animals. And so I'm an 80-20 person, right? I think that if we do 80% native plants and 20% non-invasive plants, that's perfectly fine. And that would solve so many serious problems. The movement against exotic plants, I find incredibly problematic. That is, one of the things that I spent my time looking at Harvard. I think that we can and we must figure out how to prioritize and support the plants and animals that evolved on this land without demonizing all of the other organisms that have come in thanks to our efforts. I think that that's this delicate place that we're in right now, and I'm very hopeful that this movement will figure that out, because we haven't yet. We're still using some pretty problematic language. But I think people love to feed bees, right? They're like always trying to feed the bees, and that is a noble effort. But of course, bees need a lot more than nectar, and they need pollen. A lot of specialist bees require certain species of pollen to feed their babies in order to reproduce. Even generalist bees often have only a few families of plants that they can collect pollen from, and sometimes they'll use other plants, but they still that could still have like less healthy babies and less healthy populations when they use other types of pollen. And so to me, there's like no question about the importance and centrality of native plants. I'm always fascinated by the rewilding movement that doesn't consider native plants. I don't understand it fundamentally, because I just see, bees are just one. There's 30 other orders of insects out there, not to mention all of the other animals. And when I like butterflies. I consider butterflies this perfect gateway insect for explaining the necessity in those relationships between plants and animals, because not only do butterflies have specific host plants that they require, that they evolved alongside of, but also they are one of the main methods through which the energy of the sun, gets translated into plants sugars that then makes its way into the food chain. And for animals like birds that eat those caterpillars, birds eat so many caterpillars. Even seed-eating birds like chickadees, they eat over 500 insects a day. And Doug Tallamy refers to caterpillars as baby food because they're mushy and filled with protein. And so we've seen our bird populations plummet. And the vast majority of the birds that we've lost are insectivores. And so there's all of these webs, right? That to me, all of that really shows beyond a shadow of a doubt the primacy of native plants in these dynamics to encourage these webs. But even that doesn't consider the plants themselves, right? This conversation around ecological horticulture is often really focused on animals. And I like to also think that we can make space on this land for the plants that evolved here. For me, someone of European descent, I kind of think that this is their land, and that like it's my job to make space for them and give it back to them to a certain degree, and then also to make it gorgeous, like figure out ways to make those processes beautiful and pleasurable and wonderful for people as well. But I am a human being, and I do love delphinium and peonies and like all of that stuff. I don't understand how you couldn't. But I think that there's space for that, right? Like, I don't think I get disappointed when I hear certain designers take a hard stance on either side. And I think that there's no need for purity either way. I think that there are some of the best designers in the world right now are maligning native plants for some reason that I'm just like, why do you do that? To me, it seems really unnecessary. I feel like it's as though like there's a food movement that's like this organic, farm to table food movement, and everyone's trying to be healthy, right? That's us. That's the ecological world. And then there are like a French pastry shop that uses an insane amount of butter and makes like the best food you've ever had in your life.
And he's not even vigorously now.
What?
Absolutely
Annie
with
is
you. I'm
nodding
with you.
vigorously.
Yes. Yeah, nobody needs them to be organic, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's like, please source your butter locally, right? It's the best. It's like there's room for that. There's room for all of these things. It's just that we're trying to have those conversations, and I don't think anybody needs to be maligning anybody. I think we can all agree that invasive plants need to move out of the trade, right? And we haven't even done that. We should all unite forces and get invasive plants out of the trade. But beyond that, I think there's room for all of these gardening movements.
Now,
Sorry, I've got a question just for Rebecca. With these, do you see the role of these beautiful urban spaces, urban parks, in a way so the beauty of the park and the beauty of the planting is luring in people who, who are enjoying that, and then the kind of second benefit is that they're learning about insects and they're learning. I mean, is that the model? Is that what's happening, or are people being drawn in because they want to see wildlife and insects, or does it happen the other way? Is it the kind of the parks that are drawing them in? Is what do you
Yes.
how do you
it is the Trojan horse method, right? It is absolutely come for the beauty, see a butterfly for maybe the first time in your life, right? That especially in New York City, you're reaching people who have not had the experience to see this stuff often. For the garden I just did at the Brooklyn Museum, it's in a public plaza. There's no fences, there's no gates, it's just in the middle of a public plaza in front of one of the best art museums in the city. And so it had to be gorgeous, right? It had to be stunningly beautiful. And we used all native plants for that. Native, really, really loosely defined. There's lots of cultivars, lots of plants from the Midwest. But the goal with that is exactly as you said, lure people in for the beauty. And then as they're sitting there, we've tried to place, milkweed right by the benches so that people could have the experience of seeing a butterfly eclose from their chrysalis, right? That is a wonderful thing. That is a level of beauty so far above just flowers. I love beauty. Beauty is wonderful, but it's not enough to just work for beauty for me. Like I know that, there's people who take beauty to levels that I could never reach, and that are just, it's beauty on the level that changes people's lives. There is beauty that gets to that, but I need like politics and like science and all of that stuff to do my work. And so beauty is it is that gateway. It gets people in, and then hopefully they also get to know the plants and animals that they share the city with.
And the movement of which you are part, the movement of which you're talking about, there's a lot of it in the Pacific, in the Northeast. We know it's active in the Pacific Northwest and California, blah blah blah. But any of us who know your country know just how regionally different it is. And also, I think we're also just so painfully aware of how terrifyingly divided it is. And you referred earlier about saving the bees being a bipartisan issue. And it must be one of the few bipartisan issues around at the moment. This movement towards growing native plants and urban ecology, is it one that crosses political divides? Does it? How strong is it in these states where we tend not to go, or we fly over?
So it is exactly as you were saying, it crosses the political divide. When my husband has family in St. Louis, Missouri, home of the KKK. It is.
I never knew that.
Yes.
I knew about a really bad reputation for racism. I never knew that. Gosh.
Well earned reputation. But there are native plant gardens everywhere. People planting native plants everywhere.
And of course, Missouri Botanic Garden is like the tops, isn't it? Really.
Totally. And I think people come at the movement from very different places, right? There's, as I mentioned, there are very problematic wings of this movement that I am dedicated to trying to shift us away from. But I think, there can be xenophobia in the native plant movement. And it is not the first time that native plants have been weaponized for people's political ideologies. And I think as this movement really grows, which it is incredibly popular. It is, according to certain statistics which I read, and I'm trying to find out their methodology because I can't even believe them. most homeowners in the United States planted a plant for wildlife in, I think, like 2021. That most homeowners, like most, to me, I'm so used to arguing for relevance that it's hard to turn around and say, okay, we've arrived. This is maybe we're what horticulture is now, like that. I think at the same time, I think we're just getting started. I think that this is just the beginning. I think we're continuing to grow. I think that people are so eager for this information. And again, like across the political divide, gardening is just good for people. And everybody likes to do it if they can.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned about the sort of the politics there, because and also I know in our correspondence you've I think found the European approach to growing native plants as opposed to non-native actually very different. I mean, it's very different for basically for biogeographical and historical reasons, but and certainly in the British Isles we have, we do not have much of a problem with invasive aliens. We have this incredibly tenacious grass flora that kind of fights most stuff off. And the invasive aliens we do have usually have some sort of ethnic name. It's Japanese knotweed or Spanish bluebells. And the sort of right-wing press, who are very racist and very anti-immigrant, some of the headlines you see, and this has been an issue that's been we've been aware of for a few years. It can, some of the language used about
here's the slogan. One of the slogans here that is like it's a company slogan is "American plants for American gardens." And it's just me nationalism, that I'm just like, no, this is not about nationalism.
Make American gardens great again.
Exactly. Oh my God, there are people who say that without irony. It's just like, it's being of the land, right? It's like it's trying to have a relationship to the place where you are, and that is the important thing. And that's what. If we jump to nationalism, if we jump to xenophobia, then you miss that connection to the land. You turn it into a political thing that it doesn't need to be.
We're getting a few questions in. Perhaps we should shift to the questions. Ulla, who's in Germany, in sort of central-ish, western-ish Germany. Do you have any ideas how long it took for specialized insect populations to find the new plantings? Are there green structures to connect these green spaces from the outside?
Years. These are long projects. It takes patience for this stuff to happen, especially in New York City, where those populations are low. We're out over the water. We were cut off by a major highway. It is island ecology, right? You're looking at populations jumping from one isolated little region of habitat to another one over a busy road and a skyscraper. So it's a difficult thing to do. But it, I think it took 7 years for us to get hummingbirds. And we planted for them. We left up the seed heads that they would use to make their nests. We tried to put branches out over the water, and then finally they started coming to the park. And they're not nesting yet. They're just, I'll actually tell the story of Brooklyn Bridge Park hummingbirds in the masterclass, but it takes years and it takes patience. And just, I think this work is a lot easier outside of a urban center, where we are. But yeah, it takes quite a while.
Wendy, who's in South Carolina, we're very interested in preserving and planting our natives. Interestingly, I have to order South Carolina native plants from California, which I suspect is a bit like here in Portugal. People who order, Mediterranean natives from Holland. But that is, is this sort of supply and demand sorting itself out over time? Do you think?
Huge problem. And still so much better than where we were even a decade ago. When I first started at Bridge Park, you could not get native plants. You couldn't buy them. And now we're all talking about getting local ecotypes and growing them, which are, the exact strains of plants that evolved within 100 miles of where you are. And that stuff is becoming available. My hope is that, again, similar to the sort of organic farming food movement, that really encourage people to get to know their farmers, that
Mm.
gardeners and garden designers and landscape architects can start getting to know their growers and start really having those relationships, talking about the things that they want, the things that they need, collecting seed, that stop
Mm.
buying plants, right? Start going out and developing relationships with ecologists and getting permits and sharing seeds, growing plants from seeds. Noel, I know you've written about that before. I remember reading one of your blog posts ages ago about the importance of growing plants, not just buying them. But I think that there needs to be a next evolution of this movement. So it's not just change through consumer choice, right? That is such a
Yes.
weak method of change. It needs to be more robust than that.
Yeah. Question from Kelly. You mentioned allowing managed succession at Brooklyn Bridge. Did this give the intended results, or did you have to alter the original design as certain species dominated more than expected?
Absolutely, we had to make some alterations. We were very fortunate in that the offices of Michael von Valkenburg were right up the street, and Michael himself would walk through the park every day. So,
oh, my goodness.
Yeah, no pressure, no pressure. But we had a great working relationship with them, and we were able to talk through when certain species were not performing as intended. We were the first major ornamental planting of staghorn sumac that I know of. That is not a plant that takes easily to a garden dynamic. There's a lot of wild plants that are wild for a reason, and things like black locust that it's not safe in a park scenario because they break apart so often. And so it was experimental. I think the thing when I think about MDVA and their brilliance of design and our approach to managing the landscape, all experimental. Everybody was just trying to figure out how to do this work. And in the process, that's why we learned so much, was because we were open to trying new things. But yeah, there was a lot of editing over time. But we still manifested the design, right? We were never like, I'm going to change this hillside to be something I think is cool. We were really working within the rubric of MVVA's original design.
Missy Fable flagging up the Northeast Native Seed Network is working on building a network for collecting, storing, and growing ecotypic seed. Oh, interesting.
Totally. There's lots of cool people doing cool work right now.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting times. So now one of the issues with growing native plants is that there's such a strong desire to kind of grow the pretty ones, and obviously in terms of the commercial development, we've had echinaceas up to here, which don't always make good garden plants. There are so many species that have their role in the ecology, but which don't kind of sell themselves. I mean, you've mentioned a couple that are like sumac and black locust that are definitely problematic. There's an awful lot of other things that are basically, as far as our aesthetics are concerned, just plain boring. How do you see us giving more space to them?
I think so important, and I think that is to make them special to people. That there's only one type of beauty, right, that a flower can represent. That's not true, but like there is a specific type of beauty that a flower represents. But there's also an incredible beauty that a host plant represents, even when it isn't that same sort of ornamental quality. There's this little silver plant called Pearly Everlasting that just crawls along the ground and has a little white flower. And it's the host plant for the American lady butterfly. And that is so special and wonderful that it doesn't need to be this big showy flower. You just have to tell people that story, right? They need to know the importance of it. Or there was a salt marsh aster at Brooklyn Bridge Park that was an endangered plant that we brought into the park. The fact that it is supporting pollinators and other things wasn't the primary attraction of that plant. It was the fact that it was so rare. That alone can be a reason to bring in a very weedy looking aster into landscape and just figure out a way to make it work. I'm really hopeful that plant breeders can work to really look for more ornamental versions of a lot of plants with really high ecological functionality just to get to those people who otherwise would never use them. But while also making space for those more wild genetics and plants in the garden as well. So I think that, sorry, go ahead.
Now, that's very interesting to hear you say that. I mean, basically, it sounds as if you're kind of arguing for what are called nativars, from an interesting perspective.
It's a different, right? It's different work, right? There's different places for different things. And in some places you want only, local ecotypes. And for certain plants, like when I use Asclepias tuberosa, it is only, I want to be able to say, this evolved here. I'm never going to use a cultivar of that plant. But for other things, it's just going to flop over in a garden, and there's no way to get there unless I use a cultivar. And I can't buy a cultivar. I can't buy straight species. That just doesn't exist in the trade. It's always a balancing act. And again, I'm not advocating for nativars, because the hordes will come at me.
The hordes. Who are these hordes?
The native plant folks who
Purists.
are keyboard warriors.
Do you know Daryl Morrison?
Yes, he's a mentor. He is I love him very much.
Yes. I haven't seen him for many. I met him a few times. I remember staying with him in his house, Athens, Georgia, and it was like in the middle of the woods with trees like this up against the windows. Totally. Then I heard he had moved into the middle of Manhattan, which is a totally different habitat for him.
I saw him lecture at a conference that I was speaking at. We lectured together this summer in Idaho, and he's still got it. Man, he is.
We must get him on. We must get him. He's such a figure. Yes.
Design also, like, I think if you're looking for high art in this sort of native planting world, it's hard to find. There's not a lot of people who take the aesthetics to that level, right? There's a lot of people who are gonna like do Peto Dolph over and over every day. That box is checked. But Daryl's work is unique. It is inspired. It is elegant in a way that I think, for me, is just. I think more people need to see it. So yeah, that would be awesome.
Yes. No, we must note Annie, Daryl Morrison. We must
noted.
Webinars as well. He's incredibly good at explaining about stuff. Actually, he really is. Linda wants to know: should I eliminate the Eclipata prostrata, which is a new one on me? It has shown up and reseeded everywhere.
Oh, I don't know what it is. Linda, can you tell us what it is?
Where is Linda?
I don't know is the answer.
Linda, where are you in the world?
Outside weeding, quite possibly.
There was another.
There was also a question from Anna: how large regions beyond the original range a few hundred years ago would you consider if a plant to be native to be useful for wildlife in the context of changing climate?
Such a complicated question, and I don't think anybody has a very good answer. My definitions change by the project. I think there's a meadow at Brooklyn Bridge Park where we were trying to only use local ecotype plant material, and we were trying to kind of make it as close as we could to the habitat that existed on Long Island prior to European development. That was the goal of that project. The Brooklyn Museum, I had oak leaf hydrangea in a meadow. Right. So many problems from an ecological perspective, not regionally native, not proper for that environment, but it was doing a job that was holding down the corner of a planting in a bit busy urban garden, so people wouldn't trample on it. You need a woody plant that's going to be big and robust in that environment. And so there's so many different, and you can fall down a rabbit hole, really. I remember about some group that like only wanted plants that spontaneously generated from a site, that they would like clear the soil away, and only wanted the plants that just grew naturally. They didn't want to plant anything. So you can you can take it as far as you want, right? It just depends on the context.
Interesting.
Great. Well, that's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for sharing your very interesting life and thoughts with us. I will make sure we put your newsletter, not a blog, URL, whatever, on the on the YouTube page, because it really is one of the best ones out there for getting into and finding out more about what's going on. And so thank you very much indeed. And of course, we're doing a webinar. You're doing a webinar with us, aren't you? Which it sounds like it's going to be quite focused on the development of Brooklyn Bridge. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so looking forward to it. I can't wait.
Yeah, so keep an eye on those diary pages, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, Rebecca, it's quite nice to see you on a similar scale to me. Because when I introduced Rebecca in Bergamo, I was on stage and I was like this big, and Rebecca's head was 2 stories high. It was very bizarre, wasn't it? It's quite nice to see us the same size. I thought you were a giant. Now I know.
Me too.
No, it's great. It's great to see you, and looking forward to your webinar. We've had some wonderful comments come in, which we'll copy.
We'll send you the chat.
Yeah. Well, listen, take care, Rebecca. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful, and we'll continue the conversation, I hope.
Absolutely. All the best, and goodbye, everybody else. Bye. Bye.
Bye.